Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast from Bama 247. I'm Cody Goodwin, and joining me today, our midweek mainstay, fellow staff writer Mike Rodak. Mike, I think it's really important that we have the right mindset going into this game, that we write and report and podcast with the right energy level, have the right focus to execute and cover this game at a very high standard, mostly because it's our first SEC road game of the season. What say you?
I say I was not surprised to hear that from Saban this week. That's kind of the typical after a big win, you're trying to avoid the letdown game. And, we hear that a lot, especially, FCS week. That will be coming up in November against Chattanooga. We'll be hearing Nick Saban talking about, keeping the right energy and the right focus for that game. But there's some parallels to Mississippi State because I think it's probably their easiest SEC game. It usually is most years. I think the past 5 years they've outscored Mississippi State 182-22. So it's usually one of those games you're like, from our standpoint, they're going to win. And I think Nick Saban's trying to guard against his players thinking the same thing. Is it going to be closer than usual? We'll get into that. I think there's probably some evidence that it might be. But at the end of the day, I think this is, again, still their easiest of their 8 SEC games.
Yeah, I think we'll touch on that briefly, but if there's anything I've learned about Saban just from watching him from the outside and then getting to see him up close really for the last few months, it's that he seems to be a little bit more on edge during the games where he probably knows and everybody knows that his team is favored. And I talked to Rosh Pierschbacher this summer about a lot of things, but I ran that theory by him that just I think he just wants you guys to play not a perfect game, but he obviously wants you to continue to play at a high level, even if it's a lower tier team or a team you probably should handily crush, because if you can do that against a lower tier team, you can do it against the LSUs, the Tennessees, the Georgias, those types of things. But if you show that you can't or won't, or for whatever reason don't do it against those lower teams, that's when we see the neck vein. That's when we see him yelling on the sidelines. It's pride in performance. It's a cliche, but that's why, right? I don't know. That's my theory, at least.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that he'll often say, if you're going to get up for those big games, what are you waiting for? Why are you not doing it for those games? What's holding you back? And so, yeah, I mean, he didn't seem like he was in the greatest mood Wednesday morning on his SEC conference call. He carried over, I'd say, to some extent Wednesday night, just listening to him. And he said, players have been pretty good this week, but he wasn't quite as positive as I've heard him the first 4 games this season. So, whether that means he's seen a little bit of a slide this week or whether that means he's just trying to prevent one, sometimes it's tough to tell. But, we'll hear from him more Thursday night during his radio show. And sometimes you can get a feel of kind of where his head is at about the team this week.
100%. We will discuss Alabama, Mississippi State. So the Crimson Tide play on Saturday, 8 p.m. on ESPN. Nothing like a super late, not quite SEC after dark, but still a pretty late game. Got a fun show for you guys today, though. Going to play a little game with Rodak where we assess a few specific players after the first 4 weeks of the season. Obviously going to talk a little bit more about Saturday's game. First, I wanted to start here. Mike, you've been in and around the SEC longer than I have, around college football longer than I have. Mike Leach is no longer with us, passing away last December. His death really shook up the sports world, and especially, those inside the college football world. Just huge impact, charismatic figure, full believer and practitioner of the air raid offense, found varying levels of success at Texas Tech, Washington State. And I thought, building something similar, I thought, at Mississippi State before he passed last December. I wanted to ask, as someone who's kind of been in and around, not just college football, but really the SEC, where, he sort of made another dent, just kind of in the college football world. Do you have a favorite Mike Leach story? I know you probably didn't run into him, one-to-one as often as maybe, the Mississippi State guys, but, I imagine you got to hear a lot more from him once he made the move to Mississippi State, right?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, I still don't know if I think of Mike Leach as an SEC guy. Obviously he's from California originally, coached Washington State and Texas Tech. So it wasn't, just SEC wise, like that was kind of new to him. I think he did have a stint at Kentucky, back in the 90s as their offensive coordinator. I think he actually played Nick Saban's defense one of those years. But other than that, it really wasn't until 2020 when he got hired by Mississippi State. And then it was that first game against LSU, they came out and they won. And he had the whole, the wagon and, the pirate ship and some of the quirks and things about him that, it made it fun. It's obviously, like I said, I think most people would agree, like among the SEC West, like Mississippi State's kind of the most boring, least successful school lately. And so he brought some more juice, a little bit more attention to it. That was good. It made those first couple games a little bit more fun when you're listening to Mike Leach conference calls and SEC media days. I remember him. I guess 2020 there wouldn't have been an SEC media days his first year because that was COVID, but 2021 I remember asking him a question about NIL, and you just never really know what he's going to say, and how long his answer will be, and kind of where he'll go with it. So that was fun. It was only 3 seasons that he was here in the SEC against Alabama, and like I said, those games weren't really terribly competitive. But personality wise, I think he was someone that a lot of people liked. So, obviously, will be missed.
Yeah, super, super interesting figure. It was always fun to kind of hear the stories of him, just like interview with, writers and reporters, and he'll call them up and, they talk for an hour about literally not the thing that the writer and reporter wanted to go ask him about, right? Because he's just like an inquisitive person. I think I hate to give them credit, but the Athletic ran a really neat story on like, stories about coaches with like headsets and just the funny stuff that gets said. And, I feel like Mike Leach would have been really perfect interview for a story like that, because you just wonder what he says in the midst of, like a heated, intense game. He probably pops off and says something like super like random or something or other to just like either to like calm everybody down, or like he's just thinking random thoughts in the middle of a football game. And I don't know. I obviously didn't cross paths with him at all, but like, he was such a interesting figure in the sports world that you hear about him. And so a little bit of a bummer that we won't get to see him, and obviously a huge bummer that he won't be on the other sideline come Saturday night. Yeah, so that's get the sadness out of the way first. Got a new segment here for today's show. I'd say segment. It's just kind of a game that I'm calling Stock Up, Stock Down. Pretty self-explanatory. Now that we're 4 weeks into the season, figured it was a good time to take a look back at some players. I've got 5 players whose stock I believe is trending up. 5 more players whose stock I believe is trending down. We'll go back and forth and kind of discuss what we've seen from these guys so far. Rodak has no idea that I've picked these guys for this specific conversation, so it should be fun. Kind of curious to see if you'll agree or disagree with who I picked here. But let's start with stock up. This might be an easy one after what happened this weekend and what Saban said. But Jalen Hale, stock up. True freshman receiver from Texas. Had 2 catches for 63 yards against Ole Miss, including a 33-yard touchdown catch. Hale seen a steady rise in snaps as the season has progressed. Played, I believe, 19 snaps against Ole Miss after he played 19 total through the first 3 weeks. This may and probably should lead to a larger conversation about Alabama's wide receiver usage through the first 4 weeks, because it's been really confusing. But the young guy is not only getting opportunities, but he's taking advantage of them too.
Yeah, clearly a stock up sort of guy. And someone I noticed too, I think it was a South Florida game, so 2 games ago, and you're kind of watching warm-ups before the game, and they'll have 11 on 11, and then there's usually, you have your 2 starting receivers, but then there's usually 2 other receivers that rotate in with the first team offense before they go to the second team offense, and those are typically like your number 3 and number 4 guys. And I think for the first part of the season, first 2 games, it was, Burton and Bond on the outside, and then you would see Benson and like Kendrick Law, or Benson, I think even Kobe Prentice, one of those games would line up. And then all of a sudden, South Florida, you see Burton, Bond, and then it was Benson and Hale. And you're like, whoa, Jalen Hale's out there. So that was certainly surprising. And you go back to fall camp, and he was probably running, like they would have, those 2x2 wide receiver groups that they would show on practice tape, and he was like the 5th group. So you're talking at that point, maybe the 9th or 10th receiver, something like that. And so for him to move all the way up and be, one of the top 4 guys, essentially, that's a big movement. And so, it's usually practice habits that get you there. Earning the trust of coaches that way. For a lot of players, it's special teams contributions. I can't think off the top of my head of anything that really stands out that he's done on special teams, but he might have been out there on a couple of those units, and that certainly helps. But he's also a big body. He's his exact height I'd have to pull up. I think he's 6'1" or
Like
6'2".
6'1", 190.
Okay. Yeah. So he's a little bit of a bigger receiver. And their biggest receiver last year was really Ja'Cory Brooks, in terms of a big body guy. And, the Hale ascension has really corresponded with Ja'Cory Brooks not being back with that first group. I mean, that's really been the case since the start of the season, but you'd think like after that suspension for the first half of the first game, maybe he starts to work back in and gets a bigger role. It hasn't really happened for Ja'Cory Brooks. And so that really opens up an opportunity for Jalen Hale. And that's, he took advantage of it. The 2 big catches, had a touchdown catch. Consistency is still a big problem for this receiver group in general. So, does that mean he does anything this week or the next week? We'll have to see. Like, there's certainly been guys who've had big games and then they'll come out the next game and have 1 target and 0 catches. Like that's happened a lot, both this year and in recent years. So can he keep it up is the big question, but he's obviously on the rise.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny you mentioned Ja'Cory Brooks because my first stock down name is the junior receiver, originally from Florida. Brooks had 39 catches, 674 yards, 8 touchdowns last year, 15 catches, 192 yards, and 2 touchdowns the year before that. Former 5-star prospect, top 30 overall recruit. So far, during what was setting up to be a breakout junior season, Ja'Cory Brooks has 1 catch for 2 yards. We're 4 games in. It's a little confusing. Again, I know you and I have talked about it probably more off air, but just like really confusing to see how Alabama is using their receivers. And I think the lack of Ja'Cory Brooks, I mean, it's not for lack of targets. They're really trying to maybe not force feed him, but they're getting him opportunities. And, for various reasons, he just hasn't produced. Does have a blocked punt last week against Ole Miss. We also learned, like you mentioned, broke a team rule in some capacity, which caused him to miss the first half of the season opener against Middle Tennessee. But in 3.5 games, he's played 45 snaps, has just 6 targets. Probably, again, part of the conversation about Alabama's receiver usage, but Ja'Cory Brooks trending way down. Way down might be kind of harsh, but just haven't seen it from him this year.
Yeah, I mean, I was going back and looking at the box score from last year's Mississippi State game, and he was their leading receiver by far with 74 yards. And it'd be hard to imagine in this game. I guess you can't rule it out, but it's been strange, and I asked Nick Saban after that Middle Tennessee game, not just, why was Ja'Cory Brooks not playing? And he kind of swatted that away, but also like, what have you seen from him during fall camp that led up to that? And Saban really didn't say anything. And that actually might be a good sign, to be honest, that it's not something that is very bad for him. Because I think back to like a Jai Hall, who was before your time, but pretty highly rated kid who came in 2 years ago at receiver and did not go well and had a suspension for a game. And you asked Nick Saban about him, and generally Nick Saban would kind of tee off on him and what he needs to do better, habits, off the field, academic, etc. Same thing with Jaleel Billingsley, 2 years ago when he had some issues at tight end. So if he doesn't like a player off the field and what they're doing, he actually will say it. And so for him to kind of deflect the question on Ja'Cory Brooks and not really want to inflame the situation might actually be a good sign. Nobody's really asked about Brooks specifically to Saban since that first game. It's something that now that we have a larger sample size of him not doing much, I think it's obviously going to be worth a question here soon. But yeah, it's still the, we talk about the warm-ups and where guys are lining up, and for him not to be one of those top 4 guys with the first team in warm-ups is a bad sign out of the gate, because usually he's really all the time he's been with the second team. And he has gotten some snaps in the game. And like you said, they're rotating through so many different guys where it's hard to have consistency and have any sort of momentum when, there's 7 receivers that they're rotating through now. Burton, Bond, Benson, Prentice, Law, Brooks, Hale, 7. that we're seeing. I mean, the only guy that we haven't really seen, or two, I guess, would be like Shaz Preston, hasn't played much, and the other freshman, Jaron Hamilton. So, I think it's a case of trying to see what sticks and trying to find a guy that's explosive and will give them what they've been missing the last couple of years at that position. Um, but I think it's also hard, for a guy like Brooks to try to get back into the mix when he's only getting these opportunities here and there.
Yeah. And a lot of this could be, situational personnel type thing. But, to your point about them just cycling through receivers and just how confusing it is. I mean, based on snap counts, Jermaine Burton, number one, Isaiah Bond, number two, Malik Benson, number three, 62 snaps, not a ton of targets, but he's on the field, and then you get to Brooks, Prentice, Law, Hale. Like it's just confusing. And Saban said something to the effect this week that just he needs a little bit more consistency, but it's also like, is that a practice habit consistency like you alluded to? Because they're just, outside of maybe Burton and Bond, there's not a lot of on the field consistency, right? Like Benson's getting a lot of snaps, but not a lot of targets. So it's like, are you just having him out there to, run sprints, just to kind of mess with the defense a little bit? Or I don't know. That's obviously that's something that has piqued my interest quite a bit because I don't know what they're doing.
And it's changed a lot from how that used to be. I remember like 2020, and granted, Jalen Waddle got hurt pretty early in that year, but it was Devontae Smith, Waddle, and then Mechie, and then Slade Bolden. That was kind of the third guy once Waddle went down, but really nobody else played besides that. And it was a storyline because Saban would even say, like, we need to get our young guys playing time and reps. And it was pretty much none of it. It was just those three guys would play 100% of the snaps combined. Even the year after that, 2021, it was Jameson Williams, and John Mechie, and Slade Bolden. And nobody else really got any sort of meaningful playing time. Well, last year and especially this year now, it's completely flipped over where there's not those two guys, and it's just 7 or 8 guys kind of flying through. And I think they're trying to find those two guys. If they could find, I think one of them probably will be Jermaine Burton by the end of the year. But if they can find someone next to him that they can rely upon, to be an explosive presence in the passing game, I think they'll stick with those guys more. I think it's a lot of throwing against the wall right now and kind of seeing what sticks.
Interesting tactics indeed. We'll see if there's any clarity coming up this weekend. Okay, next stock up, Dallas Turner. Edge rusher really hit his stride the last couple of weeks. Got shut out through the first 2 weeks. But the last 2 weeks against South Florida and Ole Miss, he's racked up 4.5 sacks. That's currently tops in the SEC and tied for third nationally. He's also got 6.5 tackles for loss, 22 total pressures, the third most nationally per Pro Football Focus. He's been impacting games much more in recent weeks. Numerous reasons probably play into that wicked production. But he's starting to look like the guy that's got that All-American potential, and he's being targeted by NFL draft gurus as potentially one of the first defensive guys off the board next spring. It just seems like he's truly playing like it. I know South Florida's offensive line's not great. Ole Miss clearly, I think Alabama exposed their, front five pretty handily last Saturday. But I guess it's nice to see, after a quiet first couple of weeks, Dallas Turner playing like the guy that we all thought he could,
Right. And that was a big story coming out of the Texas game was, a lot of people concerned about, I think it was 0 sacks, 0 pressures, 0 quarterback hits in that game on Ewers. And, Turner, when I asked him about that game, kind of explained it saying, Texas is going to run a lot of 7-man protections. That is a big part of Sark's offense. Keep the tight end in, keep the running back in. And they're going to get the ball out pretty quickly, which, they generally did. And that, there was no pass rush in that game. That was a problem. That was a big story. And yeah, the last 2 games, and you'd expect it against South Florida. Like if Dallas Turner was not dominating that offensive line, I think NFL scouts in that press box would, have some issues with that. That was a game where he needed to show up big time, and he did. That was a bad South Florida team that we were watching there. And then Ole Miss, you're like, all right, this is more SEC competition. Let's see how he does against that. And really well was the answer. Against a better offensive line, obviously, than South Florida. Not, they're probably not the best offensive line in the SEC, but it was much higher level of competition. By all accounts, a good offensive coordinator who can kind of scheme things and stop those guys. I don't know if Lane Kiffin did. And yeah, much better performance. And just have to see how it goes over the year. Obviously, sacks aren't always going to be the end all be all of what his production is, but right now it's kind of a Will Anderson sort of pace. If he can keep it up, 4.5 through 4 games, and I have to forget exactly what Anderson finished at last year, but if you're right near the top of the country right now, a third of the way through the year, then you're putting yourself in a spot to be right near the top of the country by the end of the year, which is where Will Anderson was the last couple of years.
Yeah. No, I think he ended last year. Will Anderson did with like 67 total pressures, just an absurd number. But I think another thing to keep in mind too is that Chris Braswell believed 20 pressures through 4 games as well. So it's not just coming from Turner's side. Like, you got 2 uber productive pass rushers coming at you at all times. And I think that's only going to bode well for both of these guys, especially, one thing noticed from the Ole Miss game, a lot of interior pressure too. So things seem to be clicking or coming together for the front 7 for Alabama. Stock down, Justice Haynes, superstar running back recruit, 29 rushing yards on 4 carries in week 1, and literally nothing since then. It's got some special team snaps. Nick Saban has said both Haynes and Jam Miller are both ready to play, capable of playing at a high level, but the lion's share of the running back touches have gone to Jace McClellan and Roydell Williams. Jam's gotten a couple touches here and there. Could be a game-by-game situational thing, but just haven't seen Justice Haynes yet. And that's worrisome, confusing. I don't know. What do you think?
It's a tricky situation for Nick Saban. And I was even listening to the SEC conference call the other day when Sam Pittman from Arkansas was talking. Somebody asked him about the SEC travel roster being expanded from, I think it was 70 before to 74 now. And one of the first reasons that Sam Pittman mentioned was it gives more players a chance to travel because mentally there's a value to that to prevent players from getting upset and going into the transfer portal. And so it kind of shows you, and this is something that coaches wanted. They petitioned the SEC for this. It kind of shows you where coaches are, where trying to keep players out of the portal and keep players happy is becoming a big thing for them. And I sense that there's, in Nick Saban's public comments on Justice Haynes, that there's an element of that going on where he's giving encouraging words about, I think this guy's going to get playing time, but, before the season's over, his role is going to expand. We've heard those sort of things from Nick Saban. Very positive, sort of reassuring. It's going to come along. We're going to see it. And my gut feeling on that is that it is trying to keep Justice Haynes happy in a situation where, before the transfer portal was what it is right now, you might hear Nick Saban say, well, you got to earn your playing time. You got to do everything right. And that's how you get on the field. It's a little bit different messaging from Saban in this case. And again, I think you have a 5-star prospect who had a great spring. Maybe it was slowed down a little bit by, the quad injury in August. But is probably going to be a really valuable player for you next year. And you got to keep him happy while at the same time you have 2 senior running backs in Roydell Williams and Jason McClellan who are pretty reliable in terms of, they're going to do the right thing in the field. They're going to pass protect. Roydell Williams had a great second half against South Florida. Jason McClellan had a great second half against Ole Miss. And so I don't think Nick Saban's jumping at the opportunity to take either one of those guys off the field or take them out of the rotation or give them less carries, but you're trying to keep them happy or you're trying to use them, to the best of their abilities. And that's the best thing for your team while also trying to keep Justice Haynes happy. And we saw, I think we talked about it last week, his dad's tweets responding to other people about it's $1 million question about why he hasn't gotten on the field yet. And again, that's the reality of college football. I'm not trying to single out Justice Haynes. I'm sure there's other players in the roster who are thinking like, am I going to get on the field this year? It's already 4 games in. Am I going to see the field? Should I transfer at the end of the year? That's how things work these days. And so, against Mississippi State, if you're able to get a lead, I think it makes sense from a big picture standpoint for Nick Saban to give Justice Haynes some carries in the second half, if not for any reason other than trying to keep him happy. And again, that's different than how he's operated before, but I think he's wise enough to understand that's how you probably need to operate this year.
Yeah, and I think to your point, if Alabama's up big late, Let the kid get some touches. Let the kid get some carries. I think that was what they wanted to do against South Florida, right? In a perfect world, they're up big, and similar to Middle Tennessee, like a lot of those younger guys get more touches. Obviously the game plan changed when it's, 3-3 at halftime and they're just trying to get out of there with a win, and everything seemingly the sky is falling quite literally in that game. So I wonder, if they're up, 4 or 5 possessions at the start of the fourth quarter, do we see Justice Haynes take them home? I think that would be one, encouraging for him. Two, maybe that, with a strong performance, maybe that earns him more time. I think another thing to consider, 4 games in, he's only seen time in 1 game, is Saban potentially thinking redshirt? Because the other thing too, Jason Roydell are gone next year. They're going to have Jam, Justice Haynes, and Richard Young. Seems like Young's in line for a redshirt this year. Do you want to keep Haynes in redshirt potentially? I know that there's, they might use him on special teams as well. So maybe they ultimately burn it. So that way you get to keep him basically for another 2 or 3 years, or at least offer him up the decision to stay for another 2 or 3 years. I don't know. There's a lot of different things at play here.
And the redshirt thing I think has lost some momentum for the higher level prospects, which Alabama 75% of their recruits are going to be, I think we're going to call blue chip prospects, like top 150 guys. And for those guys, I think the value of for the team, like saying, we're not going to play you this year because you already have 4 games and you're going to redshirt. Well, if you do that, I think you're risking losing a guy through the portal. And for a lot of these guys, the 5th year is not going to come into play. Like Justice Haynes, if he's the player that we all think he could be, he's in the NFL before his 5th year. So you might have some lower level guys, like a Cole Adams, the wide receiver, the 3-star kid, where, maybe a red shirt makes sense. You give him an extra year to hang around, and 5 years from now, he's your Slade Bolden. I think for the higher level kids, I just don't think it matters. Like, I think they all view themselves as going to the NFL in 3 or 4 years, and that having that extra year is just, especially for the guys now that it's over. But a couple of years ago, guys had their COVID year too. So they already had an extra year to use, and then you add a red shirt on top of that. It's like, how many guys are truly going to stay for 6 years? So I do think the value of, or the meaning of, like, burning a red shirt versus keeping it, I think for the top half of your prospects every year, it probably doesn't matter.
All fair points. Next stock up, stock down is it's kind of similar to the first two. 2-for-1 special here. Stock up, Robbie Oots, junior tight end / fullback hybrid. I don't know if that's officially his position the way it's listed anymore, but I remember seeing that somewhere. But Robbie has seen an uptick in playing time in recent weeks. Last 2 games, he's played 62 snaps. First 2 weeks, he played 27. Still not super productive tight end in terms of pass catching, right? Just 2 catches for 26 yards this season, but he's a willing blocker, the kind of hard hat, lunch pail, dirty work kind of player that I know Saban probably loves. In fact, this is what Saban actually said about Robbie Oots this past week. Quote, I think we trust the guy to do what he's supposed to do. He's done a really good job of executing during the games and doing the things that he needs to do for us to have success on plays. That kind of dependability is important. You can say what you want to say. You can be better than somebody else, but you've got to play better. I think that's the thing that Robbie's doing, is he's playing better because he's doing what he's supposed to do. He understands what he's supposed to do, and he's been very effective in doing it, end quote. That pairs with my next stock down, Amari Niblack, sophomore tight end who seemed prime to become a breakout star for Alabama this season, just because of his pass catching ability and also Tommy Rees's proclivity for using tight ends. But and through the first 2 games, it looked like it was bearing out, right? He played 84 snaps, 4 catches, 94 yards, 2 touchdowns. But the last 2 games, 42 snaps, just 1 catch for 3 yards. Niblack still the second most snaps out of the tight end room with 126 this season. CJ Dupre has the most at 143. But clearly, Amari Niblack has seen a steady decline in playing time, while Robbie Oots has seen a steady uptick in playing time. I believe those 2 things are related. Maybe I'm crazy. What say you?
No, I think they are. And there's 4 tight ends that were really in the mix at the start of the year. You add Danny Lewis to that, group of Dupree and Niblack and Oots. And I don't want to say it's too many, but it was like, it's hard to get 4 tight ends any sort of legitimate playing time during the course of the year. So I think part of that might have been experimenting with, what do we want to use? And as we talked about before, like Oots and Lewis are more your blockers, Niblack and Dupree are more your pass catchers. And it's almost like you're having a competition between those 2 roles. And so there, I think, yes, Oots probably takes away some playing time from Nyblack, but it could be Dupree too. If you want to have one pass catching tight end out there and one blocker out there, again, to try to avoid telegraphing your intentions to a defense, then those two guys seem like they have elevated. And it could be more Oots versus Danny Lewis than it is Oots versus Nyblack, but I do think it is a case of Nyblack not being a great blocker. And so if you do have him out there with Dupree, you're really sacrificing too much from a blocking standpoint. And that kind of leads to having Oots out there. So you at least have one good blocking tight end. You have Dupree who can catch a pass, maybe not nearly as dynamic as Nyblack can be. It's just trying to find the right combination. So, Oots is a guy who I don't think we've talked to him yet. I can't think of a time that we have. With Alabama's kind of, they're very tight with the players that they allow to talk to us, but you seem like a guy that might have a good personality. I never spoken to him. I don't know, but he has the mullet and the mustache, and players seem to love him. He can kind of become a cult hero, I think, if he makes a few plays and people kind of hear from him and gets his face out there a little bit more. So, yeah, it's just one of those lunch pail type of guys that, the stat line's never going to be great with him, but I think they really seem to like what he does on film on a down and down basis. And we heard that from Saban this week talking about, he basically does it better than the other guys out there. And again, I think part of that might have been Lewis. I think part of that might have been Nyblack. But right now it seems like Dupree and Oots are the two guys they want out there tight end. If you're in 12 personnel and you got Cody Goodwin clapping about it.
Well, and now it makes me wonder. I'm thinking real big picture here. Like, I wonder, and I'm sure Tommy Rees has plays in his playbook, and I'm sure Nick Saban has a few plays in his playbook. How do we feel about 13 personnel, right? Because Robbie showed that he can catch a little bit, right? Like he had a 20-yard catch against Ole Miss. Obviously not the at the top of his football skill set, but like he showed an ability. I think Dupre is a willing blocker. Nyblack kind of treats blocking as optional. Like we've seen some good things, right? Like I remember against Middle Tennessee, Milroe's second touchdown run, that 13-yarder around the edge. Like Nyblack was the lead blocker on that when Milroe decided to keep it, and he did enough for Milroe to get around the edge and score the touchdown. But then he's also had, I'm just in rewatching all the games, he's had a few too many plays that he just kind of takes off, and it's just like, like maybe hold your guy for a split second, just to create that hole or do something little. I don't know. Obviously that, Saban asks a lot out of his tight ends, and as he's shown, and as he said, if you don't do all those little things, you're not going to get the opportunities to do the big things. But I do wonder, I wonder about that. And I also wonder, when do we get to see 13 personnel, right? Like that's when things get really interesting, right? Because are they all going to block? Are they all going to run routes? You don't know. I don't know. Like could be interesting.
Alabama's favorite former offensive coordinator, Bill O'Brien, has unveiled 13 personnel up in New England. In fact, it worked. Mac Jones had like a 50-yard touchdown to their third tight end, Pharaoh Brown, the other day. So maybe they should bring back Bill O'Brien if they want to go to 13.
Perhaps. That could be the Iowa in me, or it could also be, the Chiefs last year. I'm originally from Kansas City. They were the most efficient team out of 13 personnel last season. And they did all right last year. So, maybe I just naturally want to see more of that because my favorite team does it a lot.
I'm surprised to hear that. The Chiefs don't seem like a 13 personnel team, but I guess that was a thing last year.
Travis Kelce, Noah Gray, and Blake Bell, baby. That's all you need.
I guess we lose Tyreek Hill. That's what you got.
Stock up. Kendrick Blackshire seen an uptick in playing time. Just 17 snaps total through the first 2 seasons. He's now played 68 snaps in 4 games this year, including 23 against Ole Miss. He's a guy that just does a lot of stuff, right? Like 68 snaps. He's recorded 13 tackles, a tackle for loss. He forced and recovered a fumble, and he has a quarterback hurry. Very productive with the snaps that he gets. And since Deontay Lawson's dealing with a sprained ankle, Nick Saban said that he's very questionable. heading into Saturday's game. Fair chance that Kendrick Blackshire and Jihad Campbell probably going to play a lot more on Saturday. Maybe earns a few more opportunities moving forward if he continues to play at a high level. Pro Football Focus rates Blackshire as Alabama's actual top overall defender on a snap-by-snap basis, fourth best run defender, second best tackler, top coverage linebacker, and a top 10 pass rusher. I like watching Kendrick Blackshire on the field because I never know what he's going to do, but I know it's going to be fun.
Yeah, it's I remember the Middle Tennessee State game. He got some playing time and did a lot in, I think it was 15, 20 snaps, something like that. And you're right, he didn't really play it very much his first 2 years, and they he was a decently rated recruit, but they brought in transfers like Henry Toto, and then they bring in Tresman Marshall this year, and they bring in Justin Jefferson as a JUCO transfer. And so that, sometimes is a sign that they don't feel great about the high school recruits that they have on the roster. And so, especially this offseason, you bring in both Marshall and Jefferson, and you had Lawson as a starter, and that kind of creates a roadblock for for Blackshire to get on the field. But Blackshire is really beaten out Justin Jefferson, who's a player I think people were high on in the summer, but hasn't, he's basically a third team inside linebacker right now, plays special teams. So he beat out him, and then you kind of had the Jihad Campbell and Sean Murphy pairing, and Campbell I think has risen higher than Murphy at this point. And then you have Lawson go down, and so all of a sudden it's Marshall and Blackshire and Campbell are your top three. And Campbell is the one who can move a little bit more, I think, than the other two, and a little bit more athletic. Whereas Marshall and I think Blackshire are a little bit more physical. And so you probably see those two guys rotate next to Campbell. I would be surprised if we see Deontay Lawson in this game. I don't think it makes sense to rush him back from Mississippi State. When you have A&M and Arkansas and Tennessee coming up, and maybe you can get back for A&M, but I don't think it makes sense to rush him back right now when you still have some bigger games that are more important than this one, quite frankly. So, it's a good position for Alabama. I think they're deep there. It's a position where I don't think it's an issue. To be honest, right now, I think that's among the defense, I think, one of their stronger spots.
Yeah, 100%. And if we get to see more Kendrick Blackshire, sign me up for that, because he's a fun player, because you just never know what he's going to do, but he's probably going to be effective whenever he does it. Stock down, Christian Story, senior safety, just hasn't really played the last 3 weeks. Played 27 snaps against Middle Tennessee in week 1, but just 4 total snaps over the last 3 weeks. He entered the season in a battle for one of the starting safety roles, decisively lost that battle to Jalen Key. Just one of those guys that we kind of had our eye on and just haven't seen this season.
Yeah, exactly. That happens. It's obviously a position where they had a good look at him in the spring, knowing that they had lost Jordan Battle and DeMarco Helms, knowing they had a freshman in Caleb Downs. They're probably going to move Malachi Moore to star. So there was an opportunity in the spring. It didn't seem like he convincingly won anything, because then they went out right after the spring and they got Jalen Key. And that was, I would say, the death knell for Christian Story, but it was obviously a bad sign. And, we never really was able to beat him out in August. And he's a guy who is class of 2020, because he's a senior this year. And so he does have that COVID year that he can use to come back next year. And Jalen Key's a 6-year guy. And so he's out the door after December. Jalen Key's gone. And so, maybe there's an opportunity for Christian Story to make one last run at it in the spring and try to earn a starting role next year, next to Downs. It's a possibility, but there's also, I think they really like Jake Pope, and Jake Pope seems to be on the rise, where he's one of those second team guys. So, maybe it's Pope, maybe it's Story, maybe it's a transfer they bring in at safety. Maybe it's Tony Mitchell. Like, Tony Mitchell is a guy I think, they seem to like as well. So, there's probably one last chance for Story in the spring if he's still here. If not, then, it's a guy who probably it makes most sense for him, if he wants to go to the NFL, to probably go somewhere else and try to start somewhere else.
Yeah. All you need is one good season at Alabama. So one of those early spring football, subplots that we'll probably be monitoring as the rest of this season goes. One final stock up, Tim Smith, senior defensive lineman that Saban said was a little too up and down during fall camp, but he's been mostly up through 4 games this season, primarily as a rotational piece on the D-line. He's got 15 tackles 1.5 sacks and a couple of pressures through 4 games this season. He got the start against South Florida because Jaheim Otis missed that game. But that was his most productive game. Tim Smith, 9 tackles, followed it up with, I would argue, his best performance against Ole Miss last week with a sack and a half. I written about this. It's on Bama 247. Please go check it out. But the defensive line rotation is really kind of starting to form. And Tim Smith is a pretty crucial part of that through the first 4 weeks of the season.
Yeah, and he was an important player last year too. Especially in the pass rush and kind of rotating in. And, got to start against South Florida because of Otis. And, that's a team where, again, you're expecting him to do big things. In the way that South Florida was kind of running their offense, it was very compact. It was just a lot of quarterback keeper type stuff and runs right into the defensive line. It was not the prettiest sight from South Florida. So it probably helps the defensive line kind of pad their numbers a little bit. But the Ole Miss game, like you said, was obviously a different situation and played well in that one too. Was clearly one of the top 4 guys, which is not a surprising thing. I think that's kind of going into the year. It was honestly, people thought it would be Tim Smith, Otis, and Justin Boybe, and then we kind of had the surprise of Tim Keenan, really emerging in fall camp, and then Otis moving outside. So, that probably knocked Tim Smith down a peg, but he's still going to get a lot of snaps. And a guy who, is a senior this year at the end of the year, you could see being a mid-round type pick in the NFL. I don't think he's probably not on the level of a Byron Young or Phil Mathis, who went in the 3rd round. He's definitely not on the level of a good Christian Barmore or, Quinnen Williams in terms of like really disruptive guys, but a solid 5 technique end. Can probably play 3 technique at the next level too. And, be a guy who hangs around, I think on an NFL roster for a little while.
100%. One final stock down. Trey Amos, similar to Christian Story, lost cornerback battle that kind of lingered through the preseason to Terrion Arnold, who's become one of the more productive, energetic members of the Alabama defense, but he got a lot of run last year, so I didn't include him in the stock up. But Trey Amos played quite a bit through the first 2 games, 59 combined snaps. Since then, just 6 total snaps. Seems like he's more almost exclusively a corner, whereas like other pieces of the defensive secondary, a little bit more versatile. I think the lack of versatility is ultimately what's kept him from seeing the field more. And then also, he got a few snaps against Texas, and as soon as he got on the field, Sark was like, we are going after that guy. And they were very productive on those plays.
Yeah, the touchdown with Adonai Mitchell. I don't think that's necessarily the reason why he hasn't played too much. I think it's more personnel matchups where they've been in a lot of nickel. And so he had 2 paths to the field in the first couple games. He was either rotating with Arnold as a base corner, which, there was still doubts about Terrion Arnold coming into the year. Like he had very up and down sort of play last year. It's something Saban even mentioned this week. Like he had to get more consistent. And he's done that. And that's obviously kind of closed the door for Amos to be a starting corner, one of their top 2 guys. But then the other path for him to get on the field is through the dime. And had 6 on the field. Arnold would move inside, and Amos would be their 6th defensive back, but on the boundary. They haven't really played dime, since then. The last couple games, South Florida wasn't going to spread it out like that, and Ole Miss didn't really do that quite as much, where they were in 4 receivers. They were pretty much sticking in nickel the entire game. Now, if this was old school Mississippi State with Mike Leach, Alabama would be in the dime the entire game, and we would probably see a lot of Trey Amos unless there was some sort of switch and they wanted to play Tony Mitchell or somebody. But it's going to depend on how many 6 DB packages they want to play based on what their opponent is doing. And we've seen Alabama. I think they're still trying to stop the run. Like they're still, even when they go to nickel, there's a lot of 3 defensive linemen type of thing, where they'll just have either one of Turner or Braswell on the field, as opposed to doing kind of the 2-4 nickel, as we've seen sometimes, where it's 2 big bodies and then Braswell and Turner on the outside. So there's not as much dime. And I think that's part of the reason why we haven't seen Amos.
100%. That was stock up, stock down. Fun little conversation about a handful of players, some good, some bad that we've seen, and for some that maybe we just haven't seen a ton through the first 4 games this season. Real quick, wanted to get your quick thoughts on Alabama, Mississippi State. This is a mismatch on paper. Alabama should probably roll even without Deontay Lawson. Again, very questionable. as Nick Saban said Wednesday night. Just likely means more Jahad Campbell, Kendrick Blackshire. But Mike, what ultimately do you want to see from Alabama this Saturday that will give you confidence about this team's future moving forward? I guess that's maybe, just looking at it, mismatch, Alabama should probably walk in and take care of business. But what's the one thing you want to see?
Faster start. I mean, their first halves have been across the board worse than their second halves, and cleaner game where, Jalen Milroe needs to stop throwing bad interceptions. That was still an issue against Ole Miss. They need to stop the killer penalties. That was still an issue against Ole Miss. And I think, run the ball more consistently. The passing game consistency is all over the board. Like, they've had the big plays, but the overall production is not there. So getting better in all those areas, I think, is kind of what they need to do. It's a Mississippi State team that I think honestly would be a better showing from them than what we've seen the last few years. Because philosophically, I think they're able to have a little more balance and run the ball. Like, I think it was just an easy offense for Alabama's defense to figure out the last couple of years. It was just pass, 2x2 formations, and Saban has just shut that down. The air raid offense has no shot against Saban. So maybe it's different, this year, but it's a really experienced Mississippi State team too. I was looking at the roster. 19 out of their 22 starters are either 4th or 5th year guys or 6th year guys. So it's a team that this is obviously their season. I mean, they already have 2 losses. Not like they're going to the playoff. Not like anybody was expecting them to. But this is always really their biggest game. This and the Egg Bowl. So do they show up and kind of make some noise in a game that a lot of people probably will be not watching because it's going to be in the middle of the night.
Yeah, no, experienced team, still capable, talented quarterback in Will Rogers. There's a lot of nice pieces, but I think the combination of just, philosophical changes, also first-year head coach Zach Arnett, I think that's why I'm looking at Alabama as like probably the heavy favorites on paper here. To tag along with the fast starts, I want to see the offensive line continue to take improvements. I felt like they took some pretty good steps forward in the second half against Ole Miss. I want to see them continue to do that. Let's run block a little bit better. Let's continue the strong pass blocking. They didn't allow any sacks in the second half. Part of that might have also been Milroe's elusiveness a little bit. But let's see them continue to take steps forward. So encouraging second half. And I want to see a little bit more of that. Mike, that's all we've got today, man. Thanks for joining me as always. You're kind of the midweek staple. So I appreciate you chatting with me today. Like Saban said on Monday, when you look at the film and things work and we do it right, why was that? Mostly because it was things that were within our control, our execution, our fundamentals, and our fundamental discipline. And I appreciate you always executing at a high level with me during the midweek on Roll Pod.
I try.
We'll be back Sunday or Monday to recap this Saturday's game, 8 p.m. start time. It's going to make our schedule a little interesting, but both Mike and I will be in Starkville to provide coverage of the game. So be sure to follow us both if you haven't already. In the meantime, be sure to rate and review the show wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Spotify, even our Bama 247 YouTube page. Subscribe to Bama 247 and 247 Sports. Guys, you can get the subscription first month for $1 and then $10 for a month thereafter for the best coverage of your favorite team. Take advantage of that, especially if you're an Alabama fan. Thank you so much again for listening. We will talk to you again soon.